Chapter 8. Towards the Rising Sun, March to May 1941. Kenneth's appointment to Singapore was dated the 1st of February 1941, and his month of leave at Rue was from about the 25th of February until the 18th of March, so there were no letters during this period. From later comments I deduced that he and Molly spent a farewell night in Glasgow, possibly at the Central Hotel. His next letter is dated from the Adelphi Hotel, Liverpool. Wednesday evening, 19th of March. Darling, as you see, I've managed to get this far safely, and a most depressing place it is too. We were about half an hour late and couldn't get into the main station, so that I had to get a taxi with all my piles of luggage. I visited the naval offices and found out all about my ship. It sounds quite nice, but very crowded. I was to have shared a cabin with the masterman, only he has apparently gone sick again, and I may get the cabin to myself. I'm afraid unless the snaps arrive in the morning I shan't get them, but I've given the hotel your address, so they should be returned. I do hope you weren't too depressed when I left this morning. I was miserable. I suppose I've got so used to you now, darling, that you are a part of me, and it wasn't till we had steamed out of the station that I realized how terribly I missed you. We should be used to partings by now, but this is so much more difficult than ever before because everything is so unsettled. I hate leaving you behind in this beleaguered island, but despite what all my intelligence tells me, I can't help feeling this war will be over by this autumn. As Lin Yutang says in his latest book, which you should get, the English are completely illogical, and rightly so. Like the Chinese, they don't use their brains, but their intuition coupled with a great deal of common sense. I read a lot of Thucydides on the train, and am thoroughly enjoying it. God bless you, and keep you all safe. This is a horrible wrench, but I know you are being brave and are perfectly capable of looking after yourself and the children, so I'm not worrying. Next day, the 20th of March, he wrote another last note, from RMS Royal Mail Ship, name deleted on Canadian Pacific headed paper. The snaps had arrived, paged by the hotel so that he got them at breakfast. They're excellent, aren't they, and catch Johnny's tough expression to perfection. He wonders if they are still having lovely weather at Rue. It's glorious here, and I wanted to go and sit out in the garden this afternoon. I miss you terribly. The next 3 letters, written between the 23rd of March and the 5th of April, were written at sea, and describe some of his shipmates and his voluntary duties and activities during his long period of enforced leisure. Darling, Sunday the 23rd of March. I don't of course know when or where this will be posted, but I think I may as well write a little periodically, and then I can post it when opportunity occurs, and in any case it may make the letter more interesting. I haven't got bored yet. Although the days do seem rather long, I'm already halfway through Thucydides, and I'm greatly in need of an atlas. I find it difficult to get anyone to play bridge with me, although there are several tables going all day, morning, afternoon, and evening. Unfortunately, I'm so senior and frightening that no one asks me, and have usually made up their own fours before I get near. However, I managed to get a couple of doctors and a soldier, ex-managing director of Dorman Long's in Shanghai, to play with me last night, so I hope that started the rot. I didn't think I should be able to get away with a complete holiday, and the OC Troops, who is about the only person on board of my great seniority, is always approaching me with ideas as to how I can help. I have already started the daily press. Luckily I found a sailor who was leader writer to the Manchester Guardian, and am unfortunately chairman of the Sports and Entertainment Committee, which promises to be a frightful task. I was also made to read the lesson in church this morning without previous warning. Luckily it was a lesson I happened to have read in the Nelson sometime in the last year. Your mittens have already come in extremely useful as the weather has been rather raw and cold. I've stuck to my double cabin to myself through thick and thin, and am now very comfortable, though it's hardly a pleasure cruise. The food question is non-existent, and we feed as in peacetime, with no restriction of butter, sugar, eggs, bacon, or anything else. Presumably the food is taken in at ports of call away from England. The worst of this business is that I shan't hear from you for months and months. However, there are worse fates than ours in this infernal war, I suppose. I'll stop now for the time being. God bless you, my treasure. The reference to the weather suggests that the ship headed first across the Atlantic to avoid German submarines. Written 3 days later was more news of his bridge companions, the 2 doctors on board, one naval and one from the ship, and the soldier from Dorman Long. The ship's doctor flattered him by thinking Kenneth was 36, or saying so. Whereas everyone else takes me to be at least 50, I am treated with terrible respect, and saluted and called sir all day long, even by colonels, although most of the officers on board are actually very young, or rather very junior. The major I mentioned earlier in this letter, his name is Scott, is a more interesting man. He was in China for about 10 to 12 years, I think, and speaks Chinese and Russian. He seems to know all the interesting people, and when he was in Manchuria for about 5 years, he was instrumental in collecting a great deal of information for the Lytton report, as the more important Chinese daren't get in touch with the Commission directly because of their fear of the Japanese. He is a veteran of the Boer War, and numbers amongst those who were his subalterns in India such people as General Brooke, the present C&C in England. He lives most of his time in Madeira, and has lots of interesting stories. The colonels referred to in Kenneth's letter would generally have been lieutenant colonels who ranked equal with a naval commander. Full colonels ranked equal with a naval captain, so the OC troops, who ranked equal with Kenneth, must have been a full colonel. Obviously, the troops on board could not spend their time playing bridge and being entertained by censorable stories of pre-Manchuria and the like. They had to be kept entertained, and would not have had the advantages that Kenneth's great seniority allowed him to have a cabin to himself, and having then managed to get his own bathroom. There is no fresh water, of course, or very seldom, but it's a nice bathroom and gives me lots of room. The troops would have been desperately crowded and hot and very much in need of the work of the Entertainments Committee. On the 28th of March, Kenneth wrote more of his work as chairman of that committee. We are getting all worked up about entertainments on board, and my various subcommittees are doing fine work. Boxing, tugs of war, concerts, community singing, lectures by the dozen are all in full swing. I, having presided over one full meeting and got all the subcommittees to work, have subsided into a nice peaceful coma. Unfortunately, I have been persuaded to give 2 lectures, one to the troops and one to the officers, A on the Navy and B on my old China talk. You can imagine how much persuasion was needed. However, I suppose I must uphold the honour of the senior service by trying. I always lie in my bunk and think of the most wonderful lectures to give. They would do Winston Churchill credit. But when I get up in front of my audience, my brain turns to jelly, and I forget everything unless it's written down. Although isolated from home and unable to communicate with the outside world, this liner, somewhere in the North Atlantic, still received world news, and Kenneth had some interesting, though possibly over-imaginative, thoughts. We heard the news last night of the revolution in Yugoslavia. I was terrifically interested, because I was so sure it would happen if they signed the Axis Pact. My personal view, quite unfounded, is that it has all been very cleverly organised by Prince Paul. I believe he allowed the signing of the pact with the express idea of arousing the indignation of the people and getting them united for once, with the idea, in fact, of working them up to war fever, as we were by the time Poland was invaded. He then produces King Peter at the psychological moment to enhance the popularity of the move and quietly disappears himself to try to pretend that it was all genuine. I wouldn't mind betting my shirt that he'll retire to Greece or even British territory and then appear again in Yugoslavia at the right moment. Nevertheless, I'm still sorry for the Greeks and Yugoslavs. I can't help feeling they've got a hard time coming before they are through. It'll have a marvellous tonic effect on our friend, though. It's sad to think this'll all be comparatively ancient history by the time you get my letter. I should imagine we shall have overrun Abyssinia by that time too, with any luck, and probably Hitler will have moved again. King Peter of Yugoslavia was in exile, and Prince Paul was acting as regent. A reading of Churchill's History of World War II makes it clear that there was much activity in the Balkans at this time, both military and political. While we were fighting the Italians in North Africa, Greece was defending itself from an Italian invasion and attempting to drive the Italians out of Albania, which had been annexed by Italy in 1939. Our advances in North Africa and the Greek successes must have constituted the marvellous news from the Mediterranean which Kenneth mentions, writing on the 1st of April. Just a fortnight since we left Tarbet. It seems much longer, but the first period of separation always seems the worst, doesn't it? As far as time goes away, I expect it'll slip along fast enough later. The news from the Mediterranean is marvellous, isn't it? I feel it may influence the Japanese quite considerably and keep them out of it, in which case perhaps you'll be able to come and join me in the autumn. I'm sorry for the poor Italian fleet. That night action must have been absolute murder. You can't miss at 4,000 yards. I'm glad a lot of them were saved. The good news from the Mediterranean would have been the engagement between the Royal Navy and the Italians off Cape Matapan in southwest Greece. This British success was partly due to the first decoding of Italian naval Enigma messages at Bletchley Park. Also, some of the British ships had radar at that period, while the Italians didn't. The Italians lost 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers, with over 2,300 dead and over 1,000 taken prisoner. The Royal Navy lost 1 torpedo bomber and its crew of 3. Apparently Prince Philip, later Duke of Edinburgh, was a midshipman aboard the battleship Valiant during the battle, operating a searchlight. Among the British ships present were several of the H-class destroyers, including Hotspur and the light cruiser Orion mentioned earlier. However, the good news didn't last, with the arrival of the Germans in both Greece and North Africa. The same letter continues. I gave my famous lecture on China and the West yesterday afternoon to all the officers, about 120 I think. Needless to say, it gave me a couple of sleepless nights beforehand, and it was very bad when given, but I think I'm getting slightly less nervous, and I'm sorry to say I talked for 50 minutes yesterday. I was given the place of honour in giving the first of the series of lectures. I'm not sure that I appreciated that kind of honour. I've now got to give one on the Navy to the troops. Another job I've slid into is organising the crossing the line ceremony, which all the soldiers are getting terribly thrilled about. It may be quite fun, although I've none of the proper paraphernalia, and I can't remember all the right patter for Neptune and Amphitrite. The old colonel, the OC troops, typical retired Indian army, very much Kipling and Poonar and Pukka Sahib. Chinese are all chinks or niggers to him, slept heavily during the lecture, and Kenneth didn't think he had any idea what he had talked about. Despite this stereotypical picture, Kenneth reported the OC intelligent and kindly, with an excellent sense of humour and very good at his job, which isn't at all a sinecure. On the 1st of April, Kenneth also reported that they were going into white. This is tropical uniform the next day, and on the 2nd of April he reported that they were closing a mail the following morning. The weather was getting nice and warm, but he was worried about the fact that there was no means of laundering on board. Luckily he had managed to get hold of all his gear, and had lots of clean whites, but they won't last forever. They are clearly heading south, and the next letter, dated the 5th of April, reports that they were as hot now as we are likely to be this trip. You know, nice and sticky, not a hope of getting cool day or night. Kenneth says that he prefers it to the cold, even though they weren't living under ideal conditions. He was looking forward to what he imagined would be the comfort of his new home. The games on board had rather ceased with the hot weather, except for bridge in the evenings, but the concert party was going at a terrific rate. We have a professional producer who is a corporal in the army, but who rules everyone with a rod of iron, and rehearsals go on for hours, even on the hottest days. There are so many experts on board of one sort and another, that all the tunes and words have been composed on board, and the whole thing is entirely original. I have nothing whatsoever to do with it, I'm glad to say, except that as chairman of the General Entertainment Committee, I occasionally visit the rehearsals. The letter of the 1st of April, briefly added to on the 2nd, finished with thoughts of home. I have practically finished Thucydides, and I'm looking forward to getting on with the history of Europe, so I'm not getting bored yet. God bless you, my darling, and don't move from Argyle unless you've got to. I'm terribly frightened the Germans will start something in the summer, if not earlier, and it may be gas, and I hate to think of you and the children anywhere near the south coast. I hope Du has thought again and is waiting up there too. I think it's criminal to move down at this juncture. I suppose Amersham may be safe, but it's not as safe as Argyle. Au revoir, treasure. Du Rickett had been feeling isolated in Argyle, and the household was talking about breaking up. The reference to Amersham presumably means that Du was thinking of taking her family there. There is also cryptic reference in the 5th of April letter to Admiral Manners. You must remind me some time to tell you about Admiral Manners. I'm afraid it would be against censorship regulations to tell you now. I have to be particularly keen on not disobeying the rules because I censor my own letters, and so have no safeguard against a slip. I imagine Jeremy is coming home in a day or two now. What fun you should all have. Don't forget to send me lots of snaps. As far as I can tell, there is no further reference to Admiral Manners in any of Kenneth's later letters, and it is unlikely that Molly ever did remind him. It is probable that the reference is to Rear Admiral Sir Errol Manners, KBE, who was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1935 on retirement, but was recalled to service as Commodore of 52 wartime convoys. He apparently wrote on theology and British Israelism. According to Careless, he was Vice Commodore of the convoy, travelling in the liner Stirling Castle. The Commodore was R. Elliot, in the Empress of Canada, which, being a Canadian Pacific ship, suggests that it may have been the ship in which Kenneth was a passenger, though there are 2 other CP ships in the convoy. Kenneth's thought that he would be coming home in a day or two was quite accurate. My school holiday started on 8th of April. These 2 letters, dating back to the 23rd of March, 2 weeks earlier, were evidently posted on Sunday the 6th of April, together with a 3rd letter, which Kenneth sent by a different route to make sure Molly got at least 1 letter. Where were they posted? Censorship, even self-censorship, didn't permit Kenneth to say, but the next letter, written on Tuesday the 8th of April, the day of my return to Rue, gives us the answer in retrospect. I spent Sunday with all my old friends, Geoffrey Palmer, Bullock, Patrick Archdale, and several others. I lunched with them and actually got ashore. We played a few lethargic holes of golf and had a lovely bathe. I spent the night with them, dining with Captain Miles and seeing the pictures on the upper deck. all prized above everything, I had a bath. The first in fresh water since I last saw you. I also managed to get a wireless message off to you, which I hope you got safely. I shan't send any more till I get safely to my destination. The old ship seemed very cheery, and very glad to get away for a change. The old ship was of course the Nelson, of which Captain Miles was still captain, until June 1941. From Careless we know that Nelson was in Freetown, Sierra Leone, from the 4th to the 7th of April, as part of the escort for convoy WS-7. This convoy consisted of 23 converted liners carrying troops round the Cape, mainly to reinforce our army in Egypt and North Africa, since the Mediterranean was too dangerous for such vulnerable ships. Even in the safer waters of the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean, the strong escort deemed necessary comprised, in addition to Nelson, another battleship, the elderly Revenge, a modern cruiser, the Edinburgh, and 12 destroyers, though the make-up of the escort seems to have changed several times. In Kenneth's next letter, Thursday, the 10th of April, we read, "The news gets worse and worse from the Balkans, doesn't it? I suppose we shall be accused of letting down 2 or more small countries, but I can't see what else we can do. The Germans can get such enormous forces there in so much shorter a time than we can. As it is, we seem to have denuded our Libyan army to a dangerous extent. However, this is all old news by the time you get this letter. It's not much use discussing the war at all, is it? It makes it feel so much worse being so many thousands of miles away from you. I must admit I don't care a damn what happens to the war, as long as you and the children are safe, and we all get together again at the end of it all. What madness it is not letting you all come out with me. I shall be quite useless without you somewhere near, as I shall be worrying the whole time. I shall do my utmost when I get out there to get the order rescinded. I'm afraid the children would hate the hot weather, but a year or so of that would be better than having you all thousands of miles away and always in danger." The news from the Balkans and Libya is reported only 9 days after the marvellous news that had so encouraged Kenneth. It confirms the purpose of the convoy with which he was travelling. The letter of the 10th of April continues by reporting the crossing the line ceremony, which was a terrific success. "I've never seen such a mess as was made of the ship, and there are many bruises and cuts today, but no one was seriously hurt. I was thrown in twice, once by the cast and once by the spectators, but everyone had a most uproariously enjoyable day. I will send Jeremy my copy of the certificate which we got out, and as I expect it would amuse him. Unfortunately, lack of paper combined with the heat which melted the jellies made it impossible to get enough certificates printed, but we managed to get out nearly 2,000. We had a great scene in the middle of the afternoon during a pause when Amphitrite was divorced by Neptune and thrown to the bears and took the leading mermaid as his bride. She and he were eventually thrown in together after Neptune had been given permission to remove his glasses and his teeth. It's getting a little cooler now, which is mainly a relief because it's so impossible to get clothes washed. I felt extremely fit all the time so far, although most of the others have been down with tummy trouble or sun. I'm considered quite the old campaigner, of course, and give advice on many and varied subjects. God bless you, sweetheart, and all my love. I wish to God you were here." The convoy is now at sea again and moving south, having crossed the equator on the 9th of April, hence the cooler weather. The 4th letter was sent to Rue and the 5th to Goblin Combe, as Kenneth had no idea where Molly would be when they arrived. These letters would not be posted until the next port of call. One reason for leaving Rue may have been the terrific increase in income tax, which Kenneth surmises may have made the rent at Rue too expensive. Molly's allotment was £60, presumably per year, and Kenneth hoped to keep it at that, but suggests that it doesn't matter if they have to sell some of their capital. as long as we are spending it on the essentials of living and not on luxuries, because it all remains in the country and our capital won't be much use to us after the war anyhow. I hope by then that unearned income like that will be taxed out of all proportion to earned income. Unearned income, that is dividend income and the like, was, I believe, taxed more highly after World War II, until the so-called neoliberal ascendancy slashed all taxes under the Thatcher government. Higher tax rates on unearned income have only recently been introduced in 2019. In fact, the family stayed at Rue at least until the 8th of May, when my school holiday ended. I spent the whole of the holiday at Rue, and it was during this month that I was made to go out with the keeper, and also visited my friend John Alsop. Another significant incident that occurred during this holiday was an example of the thoughtlessness of youth. Rue Lodge was on the rocky east shore of West Loch Tarbert. One day Jane and I scrambled along the boulders to the south from the landing stage, looking for eggs from the black-headed gulls, which nested in profusion on the bare rocks. It was quite hard work for Jane at aged 8, though I don't remember any sense of danger in what we were doing. As with so many childish enterprises of this kind, we were late getting home. Mother was lying on her bed crying, and I had always assumed that she was worrying about us and feared that we had fallen into the loch and drowned. She probably was worried about us, but I now realise that she must have been feeling very much alone, not having heard from Kenneth since he left Liverpool some 2 months earlier, and possibly wondering if she would ever see him again. In the meantime, she was wrestling with the politics and practicalities of leaving Rue, and wondering if she had lost her whole family. My thoughtlessness in mistiming our return was probably the last straw, rather than the main cause of her collapse. Her subsequent control of her emotions, I believe, has left me and possibly other members of the family outwardly unemotional. Kenneth's next letter is dated the 12th of April, and he too is almost desperate at the separation. I wish I was at Lumley now to see all the aubrietia and the other flowers. I suppose the iris are in full bloom by now. By the time you get this, the wisteria may be out too, but at least I can look at your painting and think of it. I suppose it'll be nearly your birthday too. So many happy returns, my darling, and may the next one be under much happier circumstances. I will try and send you a cable on the day, provided we have arrived at our destination by then. I'm not sending a cable on our wedding anniversary, but I am proposing to have a bottle of champagne all to myself and drink every drop to you. I'm afraid I may get rather depressed and maudlin. Is that how you spell it? But I can't help that. I'll try not to sink as low as I did on the train from Glasgow, when you left me on the platform and went straight away, and I went into the carriage as though it was just an everyday occurrence, like seeing me off to the office. I very nearly burst into tears. Never in all my life have I felt so lonely. It was as if half of me had suddenly been torn away. Thank God one doesn't feel like that often or for very long, like Jeremy returning to school, because it's unbearable. I should never have sailed if I hadn't recovered later. I'm afraid you must have had a miserable day in Glasgow, but perhaps you're getting used to me leaving you by now and don't feel it too badly. I hope you're not too depressed, darling. I've sent you 2 books for your birthday, or at least I hope I have. I think you'll enjoy them both, although I've only read extracts from Lin Yutang's book. The other one is first class. I dare say that Mother shed a tear when she eventually got this letter, but I never saw her in tears again. Meanwhile, on board the unnamed Canadian Pacific liner, Kenneth was finding life quite bearable in other respects. He was making enough money at bridge to pay his drink bill, or very nearly. The first concert was a terrific success. We had it at 4 p.m. because of the necessity of having it on deck, and it wasn't a very perfect day, but good enough. The amount of talent on board is terrific, and a good deal of it is professional, but the real find is the producer, who has produced films himself and has acted both in films and on the stage. He was in Runaway Love, and I remember him quite well. His name is Les Britt, and he really is excellent because he keeps them at their rehearsals for hours in good humour, even on the hottest days. The bouquets were a great success, but unfortunately they were too well made, and actually looked like bunches of flowers from a distance of more than 10 feet, so that they didn't get a laugh at all. It was a wonderful feat of art. Each leaf, flower and bud was cut out of some vegetable, and stuck onto stalks of some other vegetable. The bouquets were made of vegetables because there were obviously no flowers, and Kenneth had to present one, made of onions, carrots, beetroot, etc., and a little fruit, to the producer. The next letter wasn't written until the 20th of April. The interval of nearly a week explained perhaps by the fact that the previous one had only just been posted, and for once he was too busy to write home. My own darling, I wish it was 12 years ago today, and we were starting all over again, only with our present knowledge of one another. We've had a marvellous time, and a happy time on the whole, and whatever our difficulties and differences, I wouldn't change a little bit of it, would you? Except this infernal war. I'm going to have a little dinner party in your honour tonight. I've asked the old colonel, the OC troops, Major Scott, his colonel, who's going to be a neighbour of mine, and the 2 doctors. I'm having a special half bottle myself, which I'm going to drink to you, and no one else will touch. 12 years ago today was their wedding day, the 20th of April 1929. 12 years of which Kenneth had been at sea or absent from home for just on 6 years. I'm sure there was much more that Mother would have changed, but she did marry a naval officer, knowing that the more successful he was, the less she was likely to see him. She never let us know that she had any regrets. The same letter continues. We've had a marvellous break in our journey, and I've had 3 days ashore which I must admit I have thoroughly enjoyed. It's so wonderful to find a spot in the world where there is still sanity, lights, newspapers, fresh food, dancing, all that one gets in peacetime. I had one marvellous day's golf, and 1 day of complete domesticity, when I carved the joint at lunch and supper, read to the children when they were tucked up in bed, out of Winnie the Pooh and the house at Pooh Corner, and sat in front of a log fire and talked till about midnight. Incidentally, I have asked the mother of this family, which like ours consists of 3, to send Jeremy some stamps. I couldn't buy them and send them off because of the censorship. I expect that they will arrive before this letter, because we have left that port now, and it'll be some time before this is posted. My first day there I went over to my old ship to see the dentist, to have, as I thought, a small stopping put in a tooth in my top jaw. He told me there was nothing wrong with that tooth, but took out the next one, my right upper wisdom tooth, which has no opposite number, and he said was beginning to cause trouble. You may remember that your Wimpole Street dentist advised it some years ago. He took it out with a local anaesthetic, and I have absolutely no pain either then or afterwards. He didn't lacerate the gums at all, and it caused me not the slightest inconvenience. The port they had just left was Cape Town, and the reference to my old ship confirms that Nelson was still escorting them, though Careless records that the convoy had divided on the 16th of April, some going on to Durban rather than Cape Town. Nelson left Cape Town on the 19th of April and proceeded to Durban, where she arrived on the 22nd, going into dock until the 3rd of May. Kenneth's comment that it would be some time before his letter of the 20th would be posted suggests that it was at this stage that Kenneth's ship left the main part of the convoy, which was heading for Suez. Meanwhile, the war news was getting worse. Today the Germans claim to have captured Larissa. If that is so, I imagine our position in Greece must be hopeless. I hope they manage to save Egypt anyhow. Poor London, too, seems to have had a frightful time. How I shall hate all this time away from you, not knowing what's happening. I wish now you'd gone to America. I shall certainly do my utmost to arrange that you can come out to me. I wouldn't mind what happened then. I must admit that you and the children are far more to me than the British Empire or anything else. Look after yourselves, darling, won't you? And don't take any risks. God bless you. I'm thinking of you every minute of this day and longing for you, my darling. In fact, Greece surrendered to the Germans on the 23rd of April, and the Navy was heavily involved in rescuing some 50,000 British troops, roughly 80% of the expeditionary force sent in a vain attempt to support the Greeks against the much stronger combined Italian and German forces. It was after this evacuation that Churchill made the speech in which he quoted Arthur Hugh Clough's poem, which ends, "But westward look, the land is bright." I don't remember whether I actually heard this broadcast, as I did some later ones, but I have always known that Churchill used the poem on one occasion, and that it seemed to envisage the future support of the United States in the war. Kenneth's spirits were low after this meeting with his old shipmates. On the 23rd of April he wrote, "We had a very pleasant evening to celebrate our wedding, but I'm afraid it's made me realize more and more the misery of this separation. I feel I shall be terribly lonely out there, dear. I can hardly bear the thought of 2 years of it. It's not so bad in a ship, because I should have lots of companionship and not so much time to think. But what I shall do in this house by myself I dread to think, and judging by the time we're taking over this journey, I think letters will take about 3 months. Can you find out if there's any method of sending airmail letters, and then sending me one a week that way, because your letters will be the only things that will keep me sane. I'll do the same when I get out there, and even if it costs 2 shillings or so a week, it'll be worth it 10 times over. I think we're due to arrive on or about your birthday, in which case I'll send you a cable to celebrate both events. I'm sorry this is a depressing letter, darling. It's the reaction after a couple of days in harbour of the boredom and heat on board, and of the depressing war news. I'll try to be more cheerful in future." This letter went on to describe the deck tennis tournament in which he had to draw the names, and he drew the name of the best player in the ship as his partner. He had stopped reading the history of the war for the time being, because he had been feeling so depressed, and instead was reading The West Wind of Love, Compton Mackenzie, and was enjoying it. It rather heightens my depression, as it is about the period at the end of the last war when so much could have been done, and it's so obvious now that the same feelings of hatred are being roused, and that to beat the Germans we've got to become Germanized ourselves, so that it doesn't really matter to the world who wins. I'm afraid I'm considered a defeatist and decadent, because I can't hate our enemies or feel they should be stamped out at the end of the war. I just hate war and all it stands for, and shall continue to hate it. Surely after this war we can find a little sanity, but I'm afraid not. War doesn't breed sanity, and sanity doesn't win wars. As Compton Mackenzie said of the last war, if the Germans can only be defeated by Germanizing ourselves, who is the victor? Evil cannot be destroyed by evil. A little later on, talking of the Versailles Peace, he says, "Could the Germans be obliterated, no doubt it would be an advantage to the rest of the world. But they could not be obliterated, and that being the case, they must be civilized. The process of civilizing them must involve a recognition of their grievances, which have always made them such a pestilential nuisance. Unfortunately, we didn't recognize those grievances." God, how I hate this war, and how I love you, my darling, and want you with me. I could stand anything if you were with me, and now I'm making things more difficult for you by complaining instead of by trying to cheer you up. At any rate, darling, I hope my love gives you some hope, because I feel we've made something out of this world in our private life despite the difficulties, and that should make us happy. It does me, even in these moments of depression. This won't be posted for weeks, but I'll finish off now and start again later. As a postscript, Kenneth wrote that writing this letter had cheered him up considerably, but one cannot imagine that it cheered Molly much when she eventually received it, putatively 3 months later, starting again later. On the 26th of April, Kenneth added, "It's so very hot that I'm afraid a few lines a day is the best I can do. Our writing desks, which are 4 amongst 125, are set in a corner of a smoking room, come bar, come lounge, which is completely without artificial ventilation and is quite unbearable for more than a few minutes at a time. One writes a page and then retires to dry off somewhere else. We've got our canvas bath going again, I'm glad to say. It can't be rigged continuously because the same space is used for the boxing ring and the concert stage, so it's one thing at a time. We reserve the bath for officers up till 12 noon, and Colonel Ashton and I usually go there about 10:45 and get it to ourselves for a quarter of an hour before the other officers are released from parade at 11. So now I've had my bath and I'm feeling a little cooler than when I wrote a note to Jane about 10 a.m. The days all pass more or less the same. We breakfast at 8:30, and from 9 until 10:30 I either write or read and pay my daily visit to the bridge to see where we are. From 12 till lunchtime we usually dice and chat and drink. After lunch I always retire till 4 p.m, and then after tea a little deck tennis if I'm lucky, and we very often have a lecture at 5 p.m. Dinner is sharp at 7, and after dinner we always play bridge. So far I haven't sunk to playing bridge at any time except after dinner. We've found that the master is a keen bridge player, and occasionally the 2 doctors and I go up to his cabin and have a very pleasant game there. Otherwise we have to play in the one and only room where there are usually 15 other tables of bridge, a couple of poker, and probably a sing-song in one corner, and always a continuous din. We are about opposite Violet at present, but needless to say with no chance of visiting either her or Colin. I think our next port of call is somewhere I've never been before, which is unusual, and will be an experience, although I hope we don't stay long. Enough for today. I pray God you are well and happy. The privileges of being an officer, and a senior one at that, extended to the temporarily rigged seawater bath, as well as to invitations to the bridge table of the master, that is, the CP captain of the ship. The temperature is rising as the ship travels north again towards the equator. About opposite Violet indicates that by this date they must have reached about 8 degrees south, because Violet and her family live near Sao Hill in Tanganyika, which is at about that latitude. Molly's elder brother Colin was a psychiatrist, working in a mental hospital in Kenya at, I believe, Kisumu, which is very close to the equator. What the next port of call might have been is a mystery, which we will come to later. On the 28th of April, the sea temperature had been 85 degrees to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, 29 degrees to 30 degrees Celsius, for 2 days, even in the middle of the night. I'm afraid some tempers are getting a little frayed, but on the whole we keep a very equable and friendly company. I try to change my table as often as possible at dinner to get away from the same never-ending girlish chatter of the young airman who sits with us, and the old colonel gets more and more silent and tries us all. But I expect we shall survive. The 2 doctors are still the very best of friends, and with Major Scott and his Colonel Ashton, and 1 or 2 others, we have a very pleasant little coterie of our own, and as we all sit at different tables at meals, are unlikely to quarrel. The naval doctor is delightful, Scott and Ashton are the only two in the ship who I am likely to keep up with when we get to our destination. We are getting on fast with the deck tennis tournament, and my partner and I, who are now firm favourites, have got through to the semi-finals. I think it is a mixture of stripes and low cunning which gets us through. Our opponents are usually beaten before they come onto the court. Most of the soldiers assume that being in the Navy I've done very little except play deck tennis all my life. I'm getting on nicely with the history of Europe now, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it, but I shall be very glad when I get to my own house, I hope, and can read in peace and quiet occasionally. I hope you were listening to Winston Churchill's speech last night. Not that there was anything new in it, but it was an excellent survey of the whole, and putting everything in time perspective must have cheered people up. Anyhow, I was thinking of you listening in at the same time, and that cheered me up. Soon I shan't be able to listen to your 9 p.m. news, as it will be too late at night for us. But when you have your extra hour summertime, we shall be able to use your 6 p.m. news with comfort. God bless you, my sweetheart. I pray for you every night, and I find it helps a lot. I'm afraid the couple of days at our last port upset the even tenor of existence for a few days afterwards, and made my last letter rather depressing, but I'm feeling much more content, or shall I say resigned, now, and writing to you like this every few days helps tremendously. The next 5 days produced 3 short additions to this letter, with much talk of sunbathing and a second concert party. Kenneth and his partner won their semi-final of the deck tennis tournament, 6-2 and 10-8, most tiring in a temperature of about 90 in the shade. Kenneth had also started Chinese lessons, with Major Scott teaching him the rudiments. He was hoping that if he saw any light in the subject, he might get a proper Chinese teacher when he got to Singapore. You know my quality as a language learner, so you probably realise how little chance there is of my ever learning Chinese. Still, I suppose it's worthwhile trying. 2 days later. My Chinese lessons have started, and I feel even less confident than I did before. However, I'm kept hard at it. We have half an hour in the forenoon, and then we have a separate table for lunch, and try to talk nothing but Chinese at the meal. It's a miserable meal at present. In addition to that, I've now started on my course of lectures to the soldiers, and at least once every day, sometimes twice, I have to talk about the Navy to about 200 soldiers. My main difficulty is that I can't get it into half an hour without leaving out a lot that I'd like to say, or gabbling it so fast that it's almost unintelligible. Next day. I must finish this off now, darling, and get it censored. There's not much fresh since yesterday. My Chinese progresses slowly, and I've got to give my talk on the Navy 3 times today. The war news isn't very cheering, is it? I wonder when it'll all be over. It looks never-ending at the moment. All we can do is hope and pray, I suppose. My love to Jane and Johnny. I'm longing to hear all about them. I hope you've written lots, although I know how difficult it'll be when you haven't got mine. God bless you all, and all my love, darling sweetheart. Tuesday, the 6th of May, 1941. My darling Molly, just a short letter this time, but I hope a more cheerful one. I spent a very pleasant day ashore yesterday with Colonel Ashton and Scott. I can't of course say where we are, but I've never been here before or anywhere near, so it was all very interesting. We didn't do very much except eat and drink and feel reasonably cool for the first time in weeks. It's hotter than ever on board the ship, but ashore in the evening it was lovely and cool. We sat on the lawn of the yacht club for a couple of hours before dinner and just drank in the coolness and beauty. We had lunch in an air-conditioned dining room in a hotel, and walking into it was rather like going out of doors from a warm house when it's freezing outside. I almost had to ask for an overcoat, although actually I think the temperature was 75 degrees. In the afternoon we went out to the swimming club, which has a beautiful setting, and a regular shaped open-air bath about 60 yards in diameter, with a raft in the middle, and surrounded on 3 sides by lawns, very coarse grass, dotted about with tables and deck chairs. The ocean was on the 4th side. Unfortunately, the temperature of the water was about 90 degrees, and it felt warm to dive into, but it was lovely nevertheless. When we were having tea there, a hawk swept down between Ashton and me, snatched 2 sandwiches off the small table between us, and touched nothing else, although its wingspan must have been between 3 and 4 feet. Apparently that happens always unless you keep all the food covered up. The funny fact about it was that immediately afterwards the waiter came up with a large printed notice saying it was prohibited to feed the birds. Today I'm having lunch with Stanfield, who did the staff course with me on his ship and hoped to get a game of golf afterwards. However, that day ashore has made me long to get to our destination and get off this hot ship. I met a colonel yesterday who has just come from our destination, and he says he thinks I shall have very little difficulty in persuading the authorities to allow you to come out, so don't give up all hope yet. The identity of this latest port of call baffled me for some time. The 3,500 nautical miles from Freetown to Cape Town took 9 days, which suggests an average speed of around 15 knots. The Nelson's full speed was 23 knots, but the Empress of Canada, which we know was in the convoy at least as far as Cape Town, was only designed for 18. At its, unknown to me, cruising speed, Nelson would have used fuel at only about 1/5 of the rate that it used it at the full speed, Jane's, so for both liner and convoy an average speed of 15 knots seems reasonable. The time from Cape Town to the unknown third port of call was 16 days, which, at the same average of 15 knots, suggests a trip of some 5,800 nautical miles. This could put the third port almost anywhere on the edges of the Indian Ocean. My first thought was that it was somewhere on the Indian subcontinent, but then I realized it could have been Western Australia. Further thought ruled out Trincomalee and Fremantle, both of which Kenneth had visited in the Hood in 1924. The references to yacht club and swimming club suggest a very colonial setup, and the fact of being essentially a trooping convoy would suggest Bombay, or perhaps Calcutta or Rangoon. In fact, it was Bombay, where convoy WS-7X called on the 5th of May 1941. Aboard the ship, now on the last leg of its voyage, Kenneth and partner have embarrassingly won the deck tennis. As they not only instigated and ran the tournament, with Kenneth drawing theirs out of the 52 names in the hat, but also taking the shilling entrance fees, he felt sure everyone thought it was a put-up show. The lectures to the soldiers were also embarrassing him with their popularity. I find myself 2 or 3 times every day standing up in some space of the deck with 200 or 300 seated on the deck around me, while I sort of tout for the Navy. Several drafts have paid me the compliment of asking for another one, so it may be doing some good, and it's certainly done one very good turn to me, in that I'm now quite confident, and for the first time in my life have completely got over all fear of lecturing. On the 9th of May he wrote another short letter. Because this is a short trip, and I hope to get a mail off tomorrow, I believe today is the day Jeremy should be going back to school. This is another mystery. There is no suggestion that the ship called at another port, so it seems probable that the escort was leaving them as they reached safer waters, and the mail was being taken back by one of the escorting warships. 3 days later, Kenneth wrote that they were nearing the end of our journey at last. It seemed a very long trip, but on the whole pleasant and restful. The last part has been much faster. I presume because that raider has been sunk by the Cornwall. It has meant that we needn't go roundabout ways, but can go straight on. I'm glad they've caught one at least. It's most encouraging. HMS Cornwall did indeed sink a German auxiliary cruiser, the Penguin, in May 1941. The Penguin was a converted freighter which had considerable success in the South Atlantic as a commerce raider. While Kenneth was enjoying the relative rest, he was concerned about Molly and his children leaving Scotland, and anxious that cost didn't influence her decision to stay or leave. He was quite right in thinking that the 9th of May was the day I should return to school. My recollection is that I was late back, partly because of the problems on the railway with, as Kenneth recorded, "The air raids over England the last few days have been terrible, and I'm afraid Clydeside has got it again. I do hope you didn't get stuck in Glasgow with the children and all the luggage. I know it's no use me worrying about it, and by the time I get your news it will be ancient history, but I can't help being very nervous for you. Don't let money matters have any bearing on your decisions about moving or not moving, will you? Because we can easily sell out £2,000 or £3,000 worth of investments during the war if necessary to pay for our living and the children's education. I don't believe the capital will be of any use after the war anyway. I should certainly believe in using some of it in bringing you out here if and when that is allowed, and it will really be for the good of the country too, because it'll leave the money in the country and at the same time take your mouths out of it." The Clyde had been heavily bombed on the 13th and 14th of March with over 2,000 casualties and great damage to our shipbuilding. Shortly after these later raids in May, we were travelling south at the end of my holidays. The railway along the south bank of the Clyde, between Wemyss Bay, the ferry terminal for Tarbert, and Glasgow, had been cut, and Mother hitched a lift on the back of a lorry, with us 3 children, and presumably the faithful nurse, Dorothy Cotton. I don't have a clear memory of that journey, and I cannot now confirm the occasion, but I do remember that I was terrified of going back to school late, when all of my friends would have settled in for the new term. We stayed the night with Nancy, wife of Michael Goodenough, near Goring-on-Thames, and I couldn't sleep and persuaded Mother to let me have another day off before we travelled the few miles to Pangbourne and St Andrew's School. She asked me whether I was being bullied at school, and I told her that I was, in an attempt to prolong the holidays. It was quite untrue. Although I disliked going back to school, I was nearly always perfectly happy when I was there, and got on well with staff and pupils. When I was a bit older, I was invited to Sunday lunch a couple of times by Mrs. Goodenough, which meant verbal instructions from the headmaster for the journey, which cannot have been more than 3 or 4 miles, but gave ample scope for getting lost on my trusty Hercules bike, with no map, and road signs removed to baffle any German parachute troops. On the 10th of May the Germans carried out, with incendiary bombs, what Churchill described as their worst attack on London. But I don't think this worried me, as it did Kenneth. In his last letter from his floating Canadian home, the 12th of May, he wrote, "These latest bombings of England sound terrible, and I hear they've hit the House of Commons at last and Westminster Abbey. I wonder if poor old Bishop Matthews is all right. I do hope you've stayed up in Scotland and are all right." Despite the war news, Kenneth was evidently enjoying these last days of his long journey. He reminisced at length on their last day ashore, the game of golf in which he played very well for him, the clubhouse surrounded by most marvellous flowers and shrubs, the beautiful open-air swimming pool lit under water with blue lights, curry and mangoes with every meal while they were in port. "I'm sure the thought of mangoes must make your mouth water, but we make up for it on board this ship, with the temperature of the sea about 89 degrees and shut down at night. I sleep in the chart house now, thanks to a kind captain, and get a little air, but the calms are impossible." Another deck tennis tournament had been started. Kenneth had again drawn a very good partner, but this time the various pairs had been handicapped according to the results of the first tournament, so he was hoping not to go very far. He had had some fun the last few days doing his own washing. Scott and I bought some Lux and some starch at our last port of call, and using my bathroom and a couple of basins full of water, we've done all our washing. We borrowed an electric iron, and the whole thing has been most successful. It's rather like growing one's own vegetables. The results, if satisfactory, are 10 times better than if someone else does them for you. However, you would have laughed to see me sitting on the lavatory with a bowl on the deck between my feet, full of soap suds pounding away, and handkerchiefs and underclothes, and Scott at the basin starching shirts and shorts. It was terribly hot work, and of course we had to work naked, and a lot of perspiration got mixed up with the starch. Several officers passing the door offered to come and help. I think the sight of Captain R.N. in that undignified position was too much for most of them. The privileges of Kenneth's rank do not avoid the necessity for him to do his own washing, but he is sleeping in the chart house. Luxury dining continues. These last few days are quite amusing. I've been asked out to dinner most nights by various tables, and it's a great relief to get away from my own table occasionally. 8 weeks or so at the same table in this climate to an intolerant and impatient type like me is rather difficult. The old colonel is delightful, and the soldier, a senior major, is quite pleasant, but the other two I have grown to hate with a deep hatred. The airman is either a nervous wreck or just a child, and he gets excited and squeaks several times at meal, whilst he and the last member, a Commander R.N. in the Fleet Air Arm, who joined us at our first port of call, carry on their conversation in a language of their own which is a cross between nursery talk and P.G. Wodehouse, and although quite funny for a day or two, is quite unbearable after a time. Needless to say, I'm rude to them on every possible occasion, so I've no doubt they dislike me as much as I dislike them. No, darling, don't worry. I've not really been as unpleasant as I know I can be, and we're all the best of friends on the surface. However, I always have my lunch alone with Scott with the excuse of studying Chinese, and I dine out more often than not, so it's only at breakfast I have to suffer. In Kenneth's last words from this long voyage, from the 20th of March to the 14th of May, all but 9 weeks, he seemed to realise that his holiday was over, and he was perhaps feeling guilty that the greater burden of his chosen career had fallen on Molly. He was missing her, and was concerned for her safety. But at this time he may have been hopeful that she would soon be able to join him. My darling, you know how much I long for you to be with me. I'm always tormented when I get away, that I haven't appreciated you when I'm at home, and have treated you badly, or not as well as I long to when I'm away. I think of you now on that last night in Glasgow and long to have it over again, so that I could hold you in my arms in the dark and tell you how very much I love you, and long to do everything I can in this hateful world to make it heaven for you and the children. But it may be years before I get the chance again. Oh God, why do they have to have wars? I could cheerfully murder all statesmen, armament kings and bankers when I think of the war they've got us into. It's no use raving on, is it? But you will be careful, darling, won't you? So that after the war we can all be together again, even if we haven't got a penny to live on. God bless you, sweetheart. I'll write again as soon as I get settled in. All my love to you and Jane and Johnny. Kenneth. If these last sentiments were common in 1941, the success of the Labour Party in 1945 is easily understood. How much we have since forgotten, and how much politicians, armament salesmen and bankers are still calling the shots 80 years later.